Welcome to another episode of the Daily Coffee Pro Friends. Today we're asking the question, who holds the power in the coffee value chain? We have been exploring this particular question put in a different way. Who makes all the money in the coffee value chain over the last few years on the podcast? Today we want to specifically talk about who holds the power in the value chain, the coffee value chain. And this coming off the back of a very interesting few conversations on the podcast this year. And with the collision of the coffee price crisis and the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic at origin, it is very interesting to see what's going on and how we can monitor the power dynamics that are becoming very obvious as this veil is lifted on the fuckery of the coffee value chain. So let's talk about, first of all, as we kind of deconstruct this, who are the stakeholders? And once we've understood what who the stakeholders are, what are their agendas, the roles that they play, and then let's explore who holds the power. All right. Look at the coffee value chain this way. There's 3 sections. There's the producer section, section 1, and that's where coffee as a complex agricultural product is produced at origin. And let's look at this as before it gets on the boat so that it can be shipped to another country. Excuse me. So section 1 is the producer section. Section 2 is when coffee gets on the boat and gets exported across the sea or across the air and land to its destination country and imported by an importer, which will then go on to sell it, perhaps, unless they are just being the transport mechanism, but they then hand it on to the 3rd section of the value chain, which we're going to call the consuming end of the value chain. And that's the section where coffee gets sold from by an importer to a roaster, who then roasts it and sells it to a cafe or directly to a consumer. Excuse me. So, what happens at each of these steps that could determine a shift in power dynamics? It's clear that all of these sections are interdependent of each other. Sorry, they're dependent on each other. Section 2 and 3 wouldn't exist without section 1. They wouldn't exist without having producers there. And so section 3 wouldn't exist if the producers and the importers couldn't transport the coffee. The consumer needs all of them for the product to get to them, but all of them also need the consumer, section 3, in order to sell it to the consumer. So section 1 and 2 need somebody that's going to sell the coffee to a consumer to validate their existence. So if they all need each other, how can a power dynamic exist? Well, this is where a lot of the fuckery in the coffee industry exists. It's like the left hand isn't telling what the right hand's doing. And so when we spoke with on the last episode of the Map It Forward podcast, when we spoke about who holds the power in the coffee value chain, what we started to see, this is with Salome Puentes, we started to see and explore the idea of transparency in a different way. What we started to see was that the work that Salome is doing, specifically with her job as a relationship builder between the consuming end and the production end of coffee, you started to see that the left hand and the right hand were starting to get a better understanding of each other's role in the value chain. And the greater the understanding got, the more evenly distributed the power became. Because not only now was the consuming end talking about transparency to their clients, but the producer was starting to ask, I want some transparency as to what you, Mr. Roaster, are selling my coffee for, and I want to understand what your profit margins are. Once you start to have connectivity between section 1 and section 3, you're starting to see a shift in the power dynamic that is making the conversation more interesting. And so when the roaster turns around and says to the producer, I want to know what it costs you to farm and produce this product, they're saying back to the roaster, I want to know what it costs you to buy and produce this pound of coffee. Now, once we start to see that the producer holds as much power to request this information as the roaster does, and they're requiring, both of them evenly are requiring that exchange of information, that's when we start to see a more balanced approach to that situation. Enter section 2, the importer and exporter. They're the added costs with regards to this, and are often pitched as the bad operators in the value chain. I'm not here to make any statements about what I think, whether they're bad operators or not. I, in general, believe that the whole value chain has a lot of work to do, all of us. If the people who are moving the coffee around the world are not advocating for the discussion between the consuming end and the producing end, if they are advocating for a separation of that, I want you to find out what their agenda is for that. Agenda is a really important element to understanding where the power dynamics lie in all of this. And in the age of social media, it's not difficult for you to validate information that's being given to you by exporters and importers, directly with producers or directly with roasters and cafes, but particularly with roasters. Why is this important? When importers have an interest in stopping producers and roasters finding out the information from each other, what they're saying is, we don't want you to know what our cut is. And there's a misnomer in the industry that the operators in section 2 of that, very simplified kind of landscape of the coffee value chain, There's a misnomer that the people in the middle make most of the money in the coffee value chain. They're certainly making more money than they're making a lot of money, but they're not making a lot of their money based on the couple of cents per pound they make for transporting the coffee. They make their money on volume. They make their money on hedging on the sea market. It's a very sophisticated, intricate, complex way that they make money. What we need to ask ourselves as an industry is, why are they so elusive? Is it that they're elusive? Or is it that we're just not well informed enough out of laziness of how all of this works? And because it's too hard, I don't want to understand it. And that's not a good enough reason for us to not do better. Now, why do we want to do better? Why do we need to go through the process of understanding where the power dynamic lies in the coffee value chain? Well, the reason is because we want to have a long-term strategy for this industry. We want it to be alive in 100 years' time. There are a lot of factors that are in play right now that are conspiring against the longevity of the coffee value chain. And while we as an industry are looking at how do we elevate the coffee as an experience, things like climate change, things like the unfairness of the coffee price crisis, weighted primarily against the producer. These are active agents that could disseminate the way we experience the coffee value chain. And so it's important for us to get ahead of this. It's almost too late for us to get ahead of this. And if you don't actively work towards understanding how the coffee value chain is constructed and the matrix of flow through different origins. And what I mean by that, the coffee value chain is a fantastically oversimplified word or term or phrase for a very, very complex web of different supply chains. So the supply chain that operates within Honduras is complex. The coffee supply chain that operates within Ethiopia is complex. They're very different from each other in their intricacies. Now, if you're buying coffee from Honduras and buying coffee from Ethiopia and buying coffee from Rwanda, understanding how those value chains work is in your best interest. But of course, that takes a lot of effort. And in amongst all of the things that you have to focus on in 2020 in your business, that may seem like a very challenging, big ask. And therefore you divert all of the requirement of that knowledge to the people who exist in section 2 of that value chain construct. You then give them the power, more power than they should have, to make decisions about what coffees move and what coffees don't move, what coffees are priced at and what they're not priced at. But you've got to get informed. And that's the big hurdle, the big boulder that stands in the way of us progressing as an industry is the overwhelm of what's required to understand the business of being in coffee. This is why I dissuade as many people as possible from getting into coffee if they're not prepared to understand the coffee value chain intricately. And that's what's required of you if you are going to open a cafe or particularly open a roastery. The number of people that open a roastery that don't know how to read a contract is crazy. The number of people that open a roastery that don't understand what the C market is crazy. So we gotta figure out how we balance out the power dynamic. Once we balance out the power dynamic, we have a long-term industry that starts to sustain itself in a much more fun, competitive way than the oppression that exists right now in different parts of the value chain. I hope this has been helpful. Peace, love, and peanut butter, friends. Have an amazing rest.